Here I have everything laid out on my workbench so it's ready to be reinstalled. I did separate my throttle body from my upper intake plenum, and so that way I was able to really go through and clean out the throttle body, make it all nice and clean again. I need to hit it with some compressed air, but it's all super clean and everything's ready to go there. I got my coil pack and the bracket that it mounts on all nice and cleaned up, as well as my upper intake plenum, and I really went through these and it's super clean on the inside. All of our contact points, everything's cleaned up there. And then here's our lower plenum, and I have everything cleaned up on this. All of our surfaces are nice and clean and ready to be installed. This may be a bit close, but I just thought I'd give you an up close shot of what that looks like. And then I have a little portable ultrasonic cleaner here that I use, and with that I put all my bolts and my little brackets and that in there. And how I always do that is I'll put like 2 tablespoons or a tablespoon of Dawn inside of there, turn on the heater, and soak all my bolts in that in there for some time, and they come out looking great. This is what they look like when they come out, and they're all nice and clean. So we're ready to get things reassembled, and I think we're ready to start putting our intake manifold back in. So let me show you the steps that we need to take for that. The first things I want to do now is remove all these towels that I've put into all the ports, and for that I just use a locking pair of hemos, and I can just reach in there and grab those and just pull them right out. And I start with these and pull these out, because that way if anything comes out, it'll fall on our paper towel here. And then lastly, we'll pull out our towels there in the middle. And there we go. We now have those out. Now we'll pull out our centers, and I just kind of start towards the ends and work my way back, trying to kind of fold it in on top of itself, so that way it captures anything that's been knocked down in there. So I'm just going to lightly fold it in, keeping pressure there in the middle. Just like that. Now we'll go over to this side, fold it up, and I'll just lock it like that. And there we have it. And that keeps it all nice and clean down inside of there. Now, one of the last things you want to do is I go back through this again and just clean all these ports out with a vacuum, just to make sure we get any kind of dust or debris that may be left over. The other thing you should always do, if you have the ability to do it, and that is take compressed air and clean out all your bolt holes. If you don't have compressed air available to you, then go through and hit it with a vacuum. If that doesn't work well for you, the other thing you could always do is take like a Q-tip, but you want to make sure and get any kind of fluids or oils out of those areas, because that way it won't mess with your torque values when you go back to tighten it up. So let me hit this with some compressed air real quick, and then we're ready to start putting the manifold back in. Now for me, one of the final steps I like to do before I put everything back together, and I know it's overkill, but that's kind of how I do things, and that is I'm just going to take some alcohol, and I have a little cotton ball here that I put in my hemos, and I'm going to dip it in here. Now I'm going to wring it out a bit because I don't want too much on here, but I like to just go through now and just kind of clean off my surfaces, especially these valleys right here, because this here is where we're going to put our black Permatex, where all these surfaces come together in these corners, and I want to make sure that that Permatex is going to make a really good tight seal in there, and that we don't have any leaks, because primarily this is the big key spot where these intake manifold gaskets leak. So just like that. So we're ready now to go ahead and put our gasket in place. One thing I may say is before you start that, just look down inside of here one last time just to make sure, and it has happened to me, but you just want to make sure that any kind of debris or anything that may have gotten past the paper towels in there, just make sure to get that all cleaned up so you don't have anything in there. And now that I've made sure that my alcohol that I applied is dry, our manual calls for us to put a 1/4-inch bead of our ultra black gasket maker in these areas right here in the valleys where everything comes together. So just like that. So now we have our bead in the corners and we're ready to set our gasket into position. You can't install this wrong. Either way, it's going to line up the same way. What I always try and do, though, is just kind of hold it like this and line the holes up here in your gasket with the holes down there in the intake manifold, or I'm sorry, into the block, because then that way I'm not moving my gasket maker around a lot. I just want it to sit down in there, and I'll just kind of press it in just a little bit. And now you have, and it's funny, the manual calls it gasket retaining screws. They look like bolts to me, but hey, we'll go with that. And we'll go ahead and put these in place. So here we have our lower intake manifold, sorry. And we're just gonna lightly and gently set that down into place. And then what I'll do is I'll come back with a light and you'll look down. For me, it's always been easier to start with this hole here and just kind of look down there and make sure that that hole is centered over where the bolt goes in. And that looks really good. Now, when I start to put these bolts in, I will just hand tighten them initially. Yeah, we're lined up perfect on both of these ends, so we should be good. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to put our bolts in, and I just do them loose and hand tighten them to where they're just barely snug. That way, if we need to adjust and move our manifold as we're doing this, we have the room to do that. Once all the bolts are in place, then we'll snug them down, and then we'll go through our torque sequence and we'll tighten it down. Place my bolts in position. Once again, I'm just going to use my magnet and just use that to kind of line them up and just drop it down. Get my wiring out of the way here. And I can just come through just like that. And what I'll do is once I set it in, I just kind of move my magnet downward, and that way it just kind of leaves the bolt in the hole. The other thing is, don't forget, on this end here, on the bolt that's on this side, on this far end, don't forget you need to put your plate back in here that mounts up for your wiring harness for your fuel injectors. So now that everything's kind of just set into place, I'm now just going to start hand tightening all these bolts, and we're going to speed through this process. So that way you don't have to watch me hand tighten everything. And then I'll touch base with you when it's time for us to torque this down. Torque spec for these bolts on our lower intake manifold call for 17 foot-pounds. Now, what I always do with it is the first time in, when I'm tightening them in here, I'm going to run them down into where they're just touching the intake manifold gasket or the intake manifold, and then they're snug. In here is your first one. Then you'll go over here and do this one. Then back over to this one. Then this one. Back over to here. Up over to here. Back to this one, and then over to this one. So let me show you. So now what I'm going to do, let me move my light out of the way. I'm going to come right straight through here, get onto that one. Okay, and we'll go through and do it in the same sequence again. So once again, we're going to start with number 1, which is this one here. Let's go ahead and start connecting some things down here. Now, one of the things I wanted to make note to you is, before I put this all back in, actually, I went ahead and changed out all my spark plugs and put my new wires on. I didn't film that for you because I've already made another video as to how to do that, and I'm going to put a link to it for you up above that's going to pop up right now, and you can go and watch that video as to how to do that. So now the first thing we're going to do is connect our heater hose back up here into our intake manifold. Now the next thing we want to do is plug our temp sending unit back in, and don't forget this has that red retaining clip, so once you push it on and it clicks, push that red retaining clip back up so that it doesn't come off. We're going to go ahead and reconnect our upper radiator hose, and we'll go ahead and set our bracket here back into place. Don't forget, this here is what this slot on your power steering reservoir is going to rest in, and you just snug that down. You don't want to over tighten it. So now we just set this in here like this. Now we have our coil pack with the plug facing the rear of the vehicle. Don't forget, when you plug your wires back in, on the front you're 2, 4, and 6, but on the back side you're 5, 1, 3. If you don't do that right, you're going to get some real funny misfires going on. So now that we have that in position, we'll go ahead and put these nuts on. Just like that, not crazy tight. Now we're going to go ahead and plug in our wiring harness. And I'm trying to do this with my hand out of the way, best I can. And once that locks into position, then go ahead and press that red retaining tab back in so it doesn't come off. Now that we have that done, I think what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and hook up our spark plug wire so that we have everything in position. This wire goes all the way back here to this cylinder, so this is number 1, which means it's going to go onto the center just like this. And what you'll do is pull it on, and you're going to feel it click when it gets into position. Just like that. And then since I have some grease in there, then what I like to do is twist it a bit back and forth, and then that way I know my grease is in position. Our next one here will be number 3, and this will go to the very outside. And once again, twist, lock it in position. And then our last one here is going to be number 5, and it kind of goes underneath everything, and it will go right here to the far inside. Once again, I'll slide it on, kind of twist it back, and then lock it into position. Now over here, we're just 2, 4, and 6. This one here is on the end, so this here is going to be cylinder 6. So we'll take that, put it into the bottom one. Our next one will be cylinder 4. That plugs in. It will go into the middle on your wiring loom here. And then we have cylinder number 2. And we're going to go ahead and push that on just like so. And that goes into the top of your wiring loom. Now we have everything connected up over there. We're just going to move our wiring here off to the side a little bit. Now we're going to come over here and move our injector harness back up underneath. And then it has these little retainers, and we'll just push those back into our plate. We'll go ahead now and we're going to take our wiring, plug the harness in. When it clicks, don't forget to move your red retaining tab back into position. And about the only other thing you're going to be able to do now before we put on our upper is to go ahead and connect our fuel lines. And if you remember, I put a vacuum hose on the end of my fuel line here. That way it just keeps water and debris from getting inside my fuel system, and it keeps me from spilling fuel out everywhere as I'm doing my work. And now we'll take our fuel line, and you're going to push that all the way up, and you want to hear it click when you push it into position. Just like that. And then what I always do is give it a tug. You want to make sure it's not going to come off of there. You definitely don't want your fuel line coming off. That would be a bad thing. So that's good. Double check, triple check your fuel line, because if you do this incorrectly and your fuel line comes off, you could easily get a fire in here, and that is something you certainly don't want, especially with your family in the car. So I always pull on it 4, 5, 6 times. You can't be too sure. So you're good at that point. Now we're ready to go ahead and put on our upper intake manifold, and we'll tighten it down, and then we'll finish connecting up all of our connections and our vacuum lines, and we'll wrap this project up. So now that our lower is installed and everything there has been taken care of, we're ready to go ahead and put our gaskets on our upper intake plenum and get it installed. And those come in a separate bag, so we're just going to open that up and lay those out here. We're going to flip our manifold over, and these just go into these little slots here, and it has a groove and an opening on the outside of these, and basically this tab here will line up with those inside of there. Now for me, I like to just add a little bit of lube onto my seals or my gaskets here before I get them reinstalled, just so that they're well lubricated and everything's good. Just like this, and then you'll go ahead and just push these into place. Just like that, and then I just run my finger around to make sure it's seated properly. And there we go. Now that all of our gaskets are installed properly, we're ready to go and install our upper intake manifold. Now just lightly place your upper intake manifold into position, and you can look down through these openings here and kind of generally line it up with the holes, and that looks pretty good. And kind of like we did with the lower intake manifold, now we're just going to kind of set the bolts in place and just hand tighten them down to where they're touching the manifold, and then after that we'll go back through and then we'll torque them to spec. So the torque specs for our upper intake manifold bolts call for 105 inch-pounds, and so I took that, divided that by 12, that comes out to 8.75 foot-pounds. I actually set my torque wrench to 9 foot-pounds, and that will be just fine for this case. Now our tightening sequence on these bolts are, we have number 1 here, number 2 here, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we're going to go ahead now and get these torqued down to spec. Then when I'm done, I always go back through just one last time just to make sure everything is still in position. And now we're good. I'm trying to provide you with a better angle and a bit more light than we did taking all this off. So now we're going to disconnect everything up here to our throttle body again, and we're just going to start here on the bottom. And I'm trying to do this with my head out of the way. We had this vacuum line, and this just goes on this barb fitting here on the bottom. And that pops in just like that. Now next, what we need to do is connect our automatic idle speed motor and our throttle position sensor. And these are right here. And so once again, this one here will plug right onto here. You can't really put them onto the wrong sensor location because naturally they have specific wiring harnesses. Now it's funny because your bottom one doesn't have the red retaining clip, but your top one does. So once you put that in, make sure you push that red clip forward so that your harness doesn't come off of there. So that's locked into place, and then just reach underneath and push that forward. And now we have all of our wiring connected down here. Now this here will be for our MAF sensor, so we're just going to set off to the side, and we'll put this on here in a few minutes. Now what we need to do is connect our line back here from our crankcase, and we'll put that on. Now we're over to the left-hand side of our motor. I'm going to go ahead and just plug in my map sensor while I'm here, just making sure everything's plugged in good. And I'm going to go ahead and just plug that in now, and that goes up here. just like that. Plug that in, and then you'll just push that red retaining tab back in. Don't forget to loosen this nut up a little bit down here that goes inside this groove. Everything's looking good there. If you remember, I always just kind of leave my fasteners in where I'm working as I go along, so that way it makes it easier. So I'm going to remove those now. Now I'll just take... Now we're over to the left-hand side or driver's side of our motor, and we're ready to put in our power steering reservoir. However, before I do, I'm going to go ahead and connect my map sensor back up and go ahead and hit that retaining tab, that red retaining tab. Don't forget, this groove in your power steering reservoir goes over this post here. And also, I like to put my bolts, if you remember, my fasteners back where they kind of came from as I go along. Just makes it so I don't have to hunt everything down. So I'll take those back out. Now we'll go ahead and we'll take our power steering reservoir and set it into position, making sure it's going over on the bottom and lining up in the top. Just like that. Now with these fasteners, I just snug these down. Naturally, you're going into a plastic intake manifold and you have a plastic reservoir. So you don't need to torque these down, just snug them up so that it holds it in position. Now I'll work my way back in behind and tighten up that bolt that's up underneath. I'm just going to use my light here. And once again, you kind of just go underneath that power steering line and between your spark plug wires and just, whoop. There we go. And I'll give it just a little bit of a turn, and now we're secured. While we're still in this area, we're going to go ahead and reconnect our vacuum leak detection line back right into here. And then we're going to go ahead and reconnect our brake booster line back up over into here. Now it's time to put our EGR tube back into place, but as I was doing it, I realized, and this is very common, these things get gummed up pretty good, as you can see here. So before I install this, now's a great time. I'm going to stop for a few minutes, go and clean this up, clean out my tube, and then reinstall it. Well, you know, I think that was 5 minutes that was well spent. Now we have our EGR tube is all nice and clean. I went through, got all the gum and grime cleaned out of the inside, and this thing looks great, and now it's ready to be reinstalled. I always find it crazy when you're doing a job that's big like this, why not stop here and there and do the things that just make your motor run better? Sorry, bumped the tripod there. You know, we've cleaned out our throttle body, now we've cleaned out our EGR tube, we've got new spark plugs, new wires, a new intake manifold gasket. We're going to have a fresh oil change and an oil pan gasket all in this one job. This van's going to run fantastic. So now, once again, I left my fasteners in here, so we're going to take these out and then set our EGR tube in place. So now we have our bolts started down here on our EGR valve itself, and we have them started up top here. So we're good to go. Let's go ahead and reconnect our throttle cables. Once again, my fasteners are just where they were when I took them out, so we'll go ahead and remove those. Now we'll take our throttle cable and just bring it over here into position. And it will sit just like this on here. And we'll go ahead and place these fasteners back into position and just hand tighten them. Initially, we don't want to cross thread, especially going into plastic. Now sometimes you may find it easier before you attach this plate to actually run your cables up to your throttle body. I never really seem to have a problem doing it, so I'm okay with doing it this way. You can do it either way, whatever works best for you. Now that our plate has been secured, we can go ahead now and we'll just, once again, you open up your throttle. You're going to take your cable and you're going to wind it around because your groove here is on this outside. And you'll just start feeding this in through there and work it down into it. Sometimes I find it easier when it gets further back in there, to have like a little screwdriver or something to help push it along. But there we go. We have that one in. Now we'll take our other cable and just slide it in through the same slot. And just like that, our throttle cable is now connected. You're almost done at this point. Now what we need to do is put in our air intake. Don't forget, back here is your MAF sensor, and then this here is your wiring harness that you're going to plug into it there on the back side. Once again, now it has these tabs here on this side, and you'll have tabs inside of here, openings, so it's going to kind of go inside of those. You'll push it in, then come down with it, and as I come down, I'll just pull this tube in, and then once I get it into position, there we go. We'll slide it in there like that. Now we're going to tighten down our hose clamp. Just like that. Now I'll go ahead and I'll plug that sensor in. Don't forget that red tab. Push that in so it locks into position. Just like so. And then I have my little wire retainers that I'll clip on here. This one's missing one. I'm going to have to go buy one and get that put on there. You'll have one over here and you'll clip that up. And then you have this part done. The only other thing you have left to do at this point is we have our other vent here, and this will just plug in right there into your air box, just like that. And then come over here to your valve cover, and there you have it. And on that note, we're going to start to wrap this video and this project up. Now, you still have a few things left that you're going to have to do, but I wasn't going to take the time to video that because you're not going to really need to watch that because these are things you kind of already done. But let's do a quick recap so you don't leave anything out. Now, as I tilted up my power steering reservoir, I did lose a little bit of fluid that drained out, so I'm going to clean that out. So make sure to check your power steering level on your fluid and make sure everything's topped off on there. Naturally, you need to refill your coolant. I don't know if you noticed during the video, but when I started to drain it out, the previous owner had put the green fluid in here. And actually, for the Chrysler Town and Countries and the Grand Caravans, they use their own type of coolant, which is a pink. So I'm going to end up adding some water into here, flushing this out, and actually putting the proper kind of coolant in back. And so the next thing you'll do is you'll need to naturally put your wiper motor back in, your cowling and your wipers, and then you'll reconnect your battery. The most important part of this project here at the end, and in my opinion, you can't do this job without changing your oil because you've maybe knocked some things loose in here, maybe you got a little cleaner down in there. Anytime you're opening up your motor in something like this, you've got to go in and clean that up and change your oil when you're done. Now, it just so happens on this particular van, while I'm here doing that, I'm going to go ahead and replace the oil pan gasket because it was leaking. Now, I didn't put that into this video. I'm going to give you a link to that here now. So if you want to change out your oil pan gasket while you're this far into your job, you can go ahead and get that done. It's a pretty easy job. Should take you about maybe an hour to do. You may want to call it quits at this point, but for me, I needed to replace that gasket so it wasn't leaking anymore, and I'm going to do that while I'm there. So with that all being done, I also like to let it sit about 24 hours, and that gives all my gasket makers and things of that nature time to dry so I don't have any problems. If you're in a big hurry, I would let it sit at least 4 hours. 6 would be better, but I like to let mine sit 24 hours so everything gets a good chance to dry. And then I'll start it up, make sure everything's good and that I have no leaks. When I've confirmed that, then I'll actually go through, wash my motor one more time so it gets really good and clean. And then at that point, my job will be done. So I hope this video has been helpful for you. If it has, please do me a favor and just hit that like button for me. It just lets YouTube know that y'all appreciate my content here. If you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, and I also do other projects and tool reviews as well, why don't you hit that subscribe button? Stick around with me here in the garage. I'd like to have you here. Hey, thanks for watching.